好，OK，我们呢马上要进入下一个内容。下一个内容的主题呢是关于全球扩张的挑战。我们邀请到的分享嘉宾是 TeleSign 首席创新官 Stacy。TeleSign 是一家成立于2005年的公司啊。那 TeleSign 公司的产品战略啊，作为 TeleSign 公司的创始团队的一员啊 ，Stacy 呢在概念化跟开发平台和专利技术方面发挥了非常重要的作用。同时呢 ，Stacy 也是一位非常活跃的顾问，为互联网的初创企业和消费品网站提供过很多很棒的咨询。那我们下面呢就把时间交给 TeleSign 首席创新官 Stubblefield， 导播帮忙切换一下。
Hello, everyone. My name is Stacy Stubblefield. I am one of the co-founders of a company called TeleSign, and I am here today to talk to you about the challenges of global expansion in your business. So let's get started. Now, just to set some of the groundwork, let me tell you a little bit about what TeleSign does. So we provide two-factor authentication services to companies around the world. And so what is two-factor authentication? It's actually where you receive a text message with a code that you enter into a website to prove that you are who you say that you are. So for instance, if you've ever been logging into your banking website or your email website and you needed to receive a one-time passcode that you entered back into the site to gain access to your accounts, that is a service that we provide. And then we also provide information around that telephone number so that these web properties and mobile apps know who they're interacting with. So how it all started, we actually started way back in 2005. There were 3 of us, and we had a very small office in Beverly Hills. The office was actually a shared space. It was an incubator. We had our servers in the kitchen, and everything was, you know, it was a startup. It was a very small company, and everything was sort of done on a bootstrap. And these are some early pictures. One of them is me at my desk, and then we have some of our very early marketing materials that we used at trade shows. And so that was back in 2005, and so that, just to set some context, that was actually before the iPhone was released, which I believe was in 2008. That was also before AWS launched publicly, which was in 2006. So just so you have a good idea of what the landscape was like back then. And so where we are now, we have now 4 offices around the world, one in the US, one in Serbia, one in Singapore, and one in China. We have over 350 employees, and we're growing rapidly. Our customers are based in 113 countries around the world, and we do more than 1 billion transactions per month. And we work with 21 of the top 25 web properties in the world. So how did we get here? And that is really what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. So let's start, you know, where it all started, which is in the US. All of our first clients were US-based clients, of course. All of our first employees were based in the US, and then all of our original infrastructure was in the US. And so we were, to begin, a very local company. Everything that we did was very local. We were focusing on local companies that we serviced. And so it was a much simpler time back then. I assume this is how most companies start with a local presence, and you learn your business locally, which is the best way to go. I think that it gives you some good time to really perfect your business, to understand your clients really well, to make any changes that you need to make without having such a big risk as you would have internationally if you had to make these changes internationally. And you also have some runway, you know, to make mistakes and to make improvements. All right, so our first international challenge, our first expansion was actually into international clients. And so with that came the challenges of selling internationally. And so let's just go through some of these challenges. Some I think are more obvious than others, but they're definitely worth going over. So first challenge is pretty basic, the challenge of location. So when you're working with international clients, in many cases, they're going to be on a different time zone, which can, make it difficult for scheduling calls. You might have to have calls in the middle of the night or super early in the morning, but that's definitely something that, most people can handle. International travel can also be an issue. You need more time rather than just bouncing to another nearby city. You're going to have to spend some time in the air. You're going to have to deal with jet lag. It's a bigger drain on your time. You're going to need a bigger budget to make those international flights and to, pay for the hotels. And then in some cases, you or your employees are going to make sure you have, going to need to make sure that you have a passport and any visas that you might need to get into those countries. These may sound obvious, but sometimes you don't plan ahead or you don't realize that you need a visa for a certain country. So these are just things to check on before you start your international travel. You'll also, in some cases, have language barriers. Of course, this depends on which countries you're selling into, but if you're going to be selling to international clients, you're going to have to speak their language. And not just during the sales process, you also need your marketing materials to be converted into local languages. So your website, any one-sheeters that you have, any brochures that you have, even any advertising that you're doing needs to be converted into or translated into local languages. Your CS reps also need to be able to interact with your clients in their local language, so that you can continue to provide the highest quality service as you're providing to your local clients. And then any documentation that you have around your product also needs to be translated into other languages. Business practices. So business practices can vary significantly from country to country. You will definitely need to hire a local attorney just to make sure that you're not missing anything, to make sure that you have your any business licenses that you need, that you have any or that you're prepared for any taxes that you're going to need to pay. It's also, in my opinion, best to have local salespeople or a local consultant to just help you understand how business is done in that particular country, because sometimes there are things that you just don't expect. So it's good to be prepared. And then also cultural norms. They vary significantly from place to place, and that can make it really, really difficult to read a situation. So for instance, if you're in a sales meeting, I remember we would be in sales meetings in other countries, and I'm American, obviously, and I'm used to going to meetings with Americans, and Americans tend to be more open. You tend to be able to read them pretty easily, how they're feeling about your sales meeting, about your sales pitch, about your product. You can tell generally pretty easily whether the meeting is going well or not. On the other hand, in other countries, I noticed that oftentimes it's really difficult to tell. People tend to be, in some parts of the world, a little bit more laid back, a little bit more quiet. They might not ask as many questions. They might not show as many emotions. And so that can make it feel like the meeting isn't going that well, even though, you end up actually landing the client. And that just has to do with cultural norms. It's just the way that people express themselves in that particular culture. And so it's something just to be aware of, so that you don't get caught off guard. One resource that I personally find quite interesting and helpful is called Hofstede Insights. And it allows you to compare different countries based on how they basically different ways that they interact and the ways that they think. And so the types of things, here I've compared the United States and Serbia because that's where TeleSign has our two main offices. And you can see some of these differences are quite large. So for instance, individualism in Serbia, you see it's much, much lower than it is in the US. Or also uncertainty avoidance. You can see in Serbia, they have a much higher uncertainty avoidance than we have in the United States, which can mean that you want to make sure that during a sales presentation, you are answering all of the questions and making sure to remove as much uncertainty and risk as possible. So these are just things to be aware of as you go out and you look for your international clients. All right, the second challenge that we ran into as we expanded internationally was accepting foreign currency. So just to give you sort of a little bit of background about where we sit and how our cost and revenue structures work, we actually buy from international vendors who sell in a variety of different currencies. And then we also sell to international clients, which again, also use a variety of currencies. And so there's risk on both sides of on both the buy side and the sell side. So, so I'll speak to both of those. Let's see. Okay, so here is where most of the risk comes into effect. So a lot of it has to do with the exchange rates, the fluctuating exchange rates for currency around the world. And so here is the euro versus the dollar as an example over the past year. And you can see recently it's been quite volatile, but even before all of the disruption that has happened recently, you can see that it was still quite volatile back in over the past year. So let's just take a couple of examples. These are more recent examples, but we had both an increase and a decrease of around 6%, and then another increase of around 4.7%, and the strength of the euro versus the dollar. And so what does this mean? It might sound like maybe not such a big deal, increase, decrease 6.1%, but if you think about that, if you say you have margins of 20%, an increase or a decrease of 6%, can make a really big difference. So if your currency weakens by 6%, that can cuts basically directly into your margin. So it could take it right down to 14% overnight, more or less. And so these are things to be extremely, to keep your eye on very closely, because it can make a really big difference. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that right when they're first starting to expand internationally. And so there are different ways to mitigate these risks. On the buy side, some of the things that we try to do whenever possible is buy in our own currency. So if you can, convince your vendors to set prices in your currency, then basically your vendor is taking all of the risk on the currency fluctuation. So that's always helpful if possible. Giving yourself time to pay. So if you give yourself, for instance, 60 days to pay rather than 30 days or 15 days, then if there's a major currency fluctuation that goes against you, you can wait and see if it swings the other way. Of course, there's definitely risk to that. If it doesn't swing the other way, or if it continues to go negative, so there's still risk. But better than having to pay quickly and not having the choice to wait and see if the fluctuation goes the other way. Don't lock in sell side pricing. And so what I mean by this is, in some cases, we will have clients that have their pricing locked in for 30 days in advance. So that means that we can't change their prices without giving them 30 days of notice. Meanwhile, our vendors will be able to either change their pricing based on currency fluctuations, or the currency fluctuations will happen on the vendor side that essentially make us increase our costs to the point that we're making either very, very little on the client side, or it turns the pricing completely upside down to where we're actually losing money every time we, sell, every time we have a transaction. And so obviously you don't want that to happen. You don't want to get locked in on the sell side pricing while your cost is fluctuating based on currency fluctuations. So you want to be able to, you want to work out contractually such that you can make changes on the sell side pricing to mitigate that risk. And then finally, you can also hedge. So basically you can go and buy contracts so that you have a fixed exchange rate, which obviously can help immensely when you have when you have high fluctuations or frequent fluctuations on currency exchange rates. And that's something that we sometimes employ. On the sell side, so sell side mitigation, so basically how to mitigate when selling to your clients, how to mitigate these currency fluctuations. So you can price in your currency, and so that means any currency fluctuation risk is borne by your clients. This is good, obviously, it helps you mitigate your risk, but moving all of the risk onto your client doesn't necessarily always end positively. I just want to make that note, because if the currency does fluctuate in such a way that it hurts your client significantly and cuts into their budget, they're just going to reduce their, their buy, their spend over the next few months or however long it takes, so that they basically don't go over their budget if possible. So it's still going to affect you, even if the client is the one that's taking on the risk. So it's, in my opinion, it's typically better to find another way to deal with that risk. Another thing that you can do is obviously set higher prices so that if there is a major currency fluctuation, it doesn't eat completely into your margin. You still have margin that you can, that you can, such that you can continue, running your business while the currency, to get through the currency fluctuation, negative currency fluctuation. Require prompt payments. So that's another thing that you can do, so that if there is any, basically to reduce the time for there to be a major currency fluctuation. And then also, yet again, hedge. So again, buy contracts that fix the currency exchange rate. So those are some of the ways to deal with accepting foreign payments. There are some other risks involved that don't have to do with currency fluctuation. So just, dealing with banks in other countries, setting up accounts if you need to, those types of things. But really where we've seen the most difficulty is dealing with currency fluctuation risk. All right, third international challenge, hiring a global team. So why do you even need a global team? A lot of companies now run out of one location. A lot of people ask, what is the point of even building out an international team? Well, there are a lot of positives about having an international team. It's much easier to do business when you have a local team. So a local team can easily travel to meet new clients. They can, typically they'll speak the local language. They, in many cases, bring their own relationships, and all of these things are very positive for your business. 24/7 coverage is another big deal, of course, depending on your company. But if you have any kind of tech company, typically clients expect you to be available 24/7. In many cases, you can outsource this to a third party, but you probably won't have the same level of expertise and the same quality of response coming out of a third party. So if you can have it in-house with your own team, that's always better. Cost savings, in many cases, you can hire less expensive talent in other places. And then in some cases, you'll have a legal or regulatory requirement to have a local entity. So those are some of the reasons why you might want to hire a global team. Some of the challenges of hiring globally are just basic things like cultural. So very much, very similar to what I was talking about with clients. Employees in other countries sometimes think differently about work, what's important to them, how many hours a day they work, how many days a week they work, how much vacation they want to take, those types of things. Compensation can also vary from place to place. So in many cases, for instance, in the US, benefits are extremely important to employees. So if you can give them good health care, if you can give them, you know, a gym membership, those types of things, employees in the U.S. tend to highly value those benefits. However, in other countries, that's not necessarily true. In many cases, the salary is the number one way that a decision is made on whether or not they're going to accept a new position. So those are things to be aware of. You don't want to reduce the salary and increase the benefits if you're hiring in a country where people actually value the salary much more than the benefits. Tax rates are also another thing to be aware of. In some, you know, certain countries have much higher tax rates for employees than others. Another thing that is really good to be aware of that I wasn't aware of until we started hiring internationally is that in some countries, employees can be hired either as an employee or a contractor. And when they're hired as a contractor, they actually the employee himself ends up making significantly more money because of tax treatment of contractor salary, basically. However, so you'll find smaller companies hiring contractors rather than employees. However, when you dig in, you see that it's actually not legal to do that. So only small companies can get away with that. And so a bigger company comes in, and they hear that many, you know, companies are hiring contractors, and they're hiring at this much reduced salary because it ends up actually being a benefit to the employee. But in the end, that company actually, because they're a little bit bigger and they, you know, obviously want to follow the rules, they cannot hire employees as contractors. And so they actually have to hire as employees. That means they have to pay higher rates and higher wages and higher taxes. And the amount that they end up paying for each employee ends up being much, much higher than they originally anticipated. So that's something to really look into. I've seen that in multiple parts of the world. So it's not really just in one place. It's definitely something that happens fairly frequently, it appears. Legal requirements. So making sure that you know what the business requirements are when you're hiring globally. You know what the employment requirements are. So for instance, probation periods when someone is signing up, the number of vacation days that are required, how much termination notice is required. These all vary from country to country. And so they're definitely things that you need to be aware of. And then hiring best practices. So where to find the best talent, you know, what are the job posting boards that people are looking at in this particular country? What are the best colleges and universities to hire out of? What are well-respected companies in the area that maybe you can pick up some talent from? So these are all things to be aware of when you're hiring internationally. And then last but not least, keeping the global team connected can also be a very big challenge. You have some of the same issues that we discussed before, so time zone differences, cultural differences as well, but then you also have the issues of remote management. So just understanding what your employees are actually working on, making sure they're on task, making sure you're all pulling towards the same goal can be very difficult. Lack of authority. So depending on how you have your authority structure set up and your decision-making structure set up, it can be difficult when somebody is in another office and they need to make a decision, but they lack the authority to do so, and they have to wait for someone back in headquarters to actually make that decision. It creates a big lag time, so that's definitely an issue. Transfer of knowledge. You know, there's something to be said for sitting next to someone and being able to interact with them all day and seeing them around the office. You end up, you know, transferring a lot of knowledge, talking about what happened today, what happened yesterday, what you learned. That doesn't necessarily happen for people who are in a remote office. They lose out on a lot of that knowledge transfer. And that is an issue for sure. And then the feeling of being on the outside is something that I've noticed quite frequently. And a lot of that probably does have to do with the knowledge transfer and some of the cultural differences and the time differences. But just we've seen that people in other offices can sometimes just feel like they're not necessarily part of the team because they're not seeing people every day. They're not interacting every day, and they just sort of feel like disconnected. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And so some of the things that we've done to correct some of these issues is number one, autonomy. So giving employees in global offices enough authority that they can do their job without having to wait for teams in headquarters or in another office to actually give them the authority they need. So making sure that they can make the decisions that are going to drive them forward. Documentation is also a huge thing. So creating guides for onboarding, documenting how systems work, providing ongoing training, just making sure that employees in remote locations have all of the information that they need to be able to do their job is extremely important, because they can't just necessarily look over and ask someone a question. They need to have the information that they need, that they can refer to, you know, at any time of the day. Using video conferencing and other tools extensively, any kind of communication tool that you can use to keep people connected and make sure that they see each other's faces. Try to get them to actually turn on the video feature, not just use the audio feature, because it helps them connect a little bit more, those types of things. And then group activities and learning is another thing that's been really big for us. So making sure to have employees travel between offices, meet their fellow employees in other offices, do company-sponsored group outings so people get to know each other, even sponsoring courses to learn about the other culture can be extremely helpful. So any of these types of things that you can do to really bring people together and create this cohesive team is something that we would highly recommend. So I hope that that was helpful to you. And if you have any questions, again, my name is Stacy Stubblefield with a company called TeleSign, and I really appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much.
哦，刚刚 OK， 信号重新回来，不好意思感谢，再次感谢嘉宾 ，Thanks， 感谢 Stacy W。全球化的这个发展呢，对于要实现扩张的公司来讲，无疑是一个非常有利的手段啊。但是与此同时，要实现真正意义上的全球化，对于公司和组织而言呢，都是一个非常不小的挑战。刚刚的这个分享里面呢，谈到如果公司的业务拓展到世界各地，你就可能会遇到很多潜在的问题，比如说人才的雇佣、文化、税收、员工福利的差异化等等。
大家好，我叫 Michael， 或者米商。
提到几个方案，比如说无政府，尽量去减少国际业务的审批流；再比如准备好完备的文件；再比如通过线上的手段，用视频会议，比如说用 Zoom 等等。再比如呢，鼓励组织员工更好去融入当地的文化。这个就是刚刚这个视频的大概的一个主要的内容。那么 TeleSign 呢，作为一家快速发展的公司，他们致力于通过创新，而且是特别容易易用的解决方案来开展业务。TeleSign 的用户策略在不同的国家和地区也是相对动态变化的。我们的嘉宾刚刚也为我们讲述了 TeleSign 在发展过程当中遇到的不同的问题以及解决方案。扩张当中所会遇到的问题。好，希望 TeleSign 的这个案例能够对您有所启发。